Welcome to Evolution Green Works. I'm your host, Lorena Mitchell, and we have a special guest today from Sun Certified Builders Co-op. His name is Evan Provin. I'm going to welcome him to the show, and thank you for joining us, Evolutionaries, and our sponsors, Case Populaire and Evolve Green, for this show. Hey, how are you doing, Evan?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good. So I understand you had to kind of stop doing what you were doing with the high winds today. You want to tell me about the current project you're working on?
For sure, yeah. We're putting together a woodworking studio for Fort White Alive on site. Fort White has their farm program there, which they operate as a social enterprise. And so what they try and do is take kids from the inner city, and they take them out to the farm site, and they teach them basic farming skills, agricultural skills, gardening and livestock tending, stuff like that. And so they want to expand that program again through a social enterprise model. But they decided that woodworking studio would be a good opportunity for them out there. And so the building itself is going to have some office space for some Fort White staff, but also a classroom and assembly area, and then a woodworking shop itself. The building, though, Fort White asked for a building that would perform to about 50% better than the National Energy Code. And so I think that we submitted our proposal using about a 70% targeted reduction in primary energy use. And that's kind of, where we think is kind of the minimum that we would like to get a building to.
How big is it?
The building is about 2,300 square feet. It's got 10-foot ceilings because it's a wood shop. So we wanted that little bit extra height so that we could turn material around. But, we usually try and stay pretty compact with the buildings that we design. Typically, we're a design builder. And so this was similar with this project. Fort White asked for a design build proposal. And so that's what we did.
Excellent. So what type of heating have you selected for this building?
Well, it's kind of been an evolution in terms of, previously we've stuck with electric heating and not installed any cooling. And that's kind of been driven by passive house. Not a lot of passive house buildings previously had air conditioning, and we were kind of just relying on shading and the thick walls to kind of keep the interior spaces comfortable. But we've noticed that with recent climate change, the summers are just getting hotter, and we don't have the cooler periods at nighttime to be able to cool the building back down. And so you end up with this incremental temperature creep.
So climate change is actually changing the way you build because it's actually getting hotter.
Over the short term, we've noticed that the summertime temperatures just aren't cool enough at night to provide the cool off that we need to keep these buildings comfortable.
Right, because you're using like a thermal mass loading. Basically, you load cool or you load heat, right? Like a log house.
That flywheel effect through that wall system. That's part of the reason that we like cellulose, is because it's dense enough that it has that decrement delay that allows for that slow movement of heat through the wall system. So.
And how thick are the walls?
Well, our standard wall system right now is a 16-inch Larson truss, or modified Larson truss, with a 3-inch service cavity. So the Larson truss portion is insulated with cellulose, and then we're using a rock wool product to insulate that service cavity. So we've got a total of about 19 inches of insulation, which has an actual R value of about 63.
63 on a wall structure.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
But so back to the question about the heating system, though.
Yeah.
So now that we are looking at incorporating cooling into these buildings, we've gone from electric baseboards and duct heaters in the HRV to a air source heat pumps. And that's also kind of where passive house is moving in Europe. There's a lot more of these much smaller air source heat pumps that are available, because that's kind of been the main issue previously with the air source heat pumps, is that they're mainly too large to operate for the heating demand and cooling demand that we have in these very energy efficient buildings. But now that the systems are becoming more popular and more efficient, we're able to source these. For example, the unit for the Fort White building is a Daikin, and it's able to operate down to minus 25 without using electric backup. So we're able to operate using that air source heat pump for the majority of our heating season. So it's pretty promising.
Well, and also there's some available in Winnipeg. They're just called cold climate heat pumps, and you can purchase the heat pump itself. So that seems to be a more viable option here in Manitoba.
Right, yeah.
So, and it also can create heated water as well, right? So if you have like a solar store tank, then you could do that. And then couldn't you also then use solar thermal to add some heat in as well to the other times of the year, or is that needed?
Well, solar thermal I think is a great option, because another kind of feature that we typically build into our residential buildings is a ground source heat pump. And the ground source heat pump we use, it doesn't have a compressor. It's just a passive heat exchanger system. But we just use a radiator basically at the air intake on our HRV, and so we use the ground source heat pump to pull tempered glycol, or to pull heat out of the ground with a small circulation pump and an Arduino controller that we developed these systems in house, and that controller basically just interlocks the HRV with the circulation pump, and we're able to move that heat from the ground up to temper the fresh air for the HRV. And you can use it in the summer for some passive cooling, or in the wintertime to temper the fresh air coming in. So basically it helps in the wintertime. It especially helps to stop the HRV from going into a defrost cycle, which is the most energy intensive mode of operation for an HRV typically. So
I have a snapshot of one of your walls, and I'm just going to put up over top of our faces so you can discuss what you're seeing there with everybody. Because you have said Larson wall. Is this a part of the Larson wall system?
Yeah, so the original Larson truss wall, they used 2x4 blocking in between the structural wall and the standoff wall.
And is that to break the cold barrier?
Yeah, to reduce the thermal bridge. I don't recall what the spacing on their blocking was, or the gussets as we call them, to connect the two. But we've gone to a 3/8 plywood gusset, and so we're connecting our structural wall and the standoff wall with those plywood gussets that you can see in the interior of the wall cavity there. And on this project, I believe that those gussets were on 36-inch centers.
Okay.
So we're able to spread them out and still maintain that structural integrity, because the structural wall is the only part of that wall that's actually sitting on the floor. That carries the point load up, and the standoff wall on the outside is basically only carrying the weight of the exterior siding.
Oh, okay. And I see like a big slope going up to one side. Would this be like a building or a home that would slope only to one side?
This was it was a difficult project that we chose for our kind of proof of concept of these prefabricated wall systems, because as you could tell, it had a monoslope roof on it.
Right.
And instead of building the monoslope with a standard interior 8-foot ceiling height and a sloped rafter, we had a roof truss system and those rake head walls on the east and west, and then we had a 14.5-foot tall wall on the north side of the building, and then that 7.5-foot tall wall on the south side. So it's
and can I ask you a question? Is there a reason that the tall wall is on the north side versus on the south side?
Yeah, so that the owner of that project is an architect himself, and so he did have a solar PV array that he was going to install onto the roof there. So yeah, so the roof slope was basically designed to optimize solar heat.
But then don't you have to be tall enough in order to utilize the sun that comes on the south side, like especially for the winter?
Well, in that neighborhood, it's mainly bungalows, and that project was an addition of a second story onto an existing bungalow. So, unless his neighbors decide to do the same thing, I think he's going to be he'll have unobstructed sun for the most part.
Well, that's good. That's good. Excellent. Excellent. So for Sun Certified Builders Co-op, can you tell me a little bit about your organization and how long you've been doing business?
Absolutely, yeah. So we incorporated in 2012. At that point in time, we were mainly a kind of a family business, but with the idea that we were going to grow this into a company that was capable of taking on larger projects, and that was the main impetus for incorporating. As individuals, my dad and myself and my cousin, we had all been doing some smaller contracting jobs, renovations, and stuff like that, and we would collaborate on some projects, but we really wanted to start building new houses, and that was why we decided to incorporate it. 2012 happened to be the International Year of the Co-op. It was the United Nations and the International Cooperative Association had declared, the International Year of the Co-op. So there was a lot of publication about co-ops, and at the time, the provincial government had some incentives on, like we had a subsidized incorporation fees and stuff like that, and we were able to apply for a few grants for operating costs, capital purchases and stuff like that. But the other thing is that we really like the co-op model because it's more kind of focused on the employees and also on sustainability and making an impact in your community. Concern for a community is one of the main principles of cooperatives. And so we really liked the kind of values that we share with the cooperative model. So it's important to us to be able to give back to the community and to operate in a way that's sustainable. So since 2012, we've added 2 additional members. Unfortunately, in 2018, the end of 2018, my dad passed away. He was one of the founding members of Sun Certified, and he was really our kind of technical guru. He had been pursuing energy efficient building back from the late 70s when that Larson Trust was actually developed for a project that the Saskatchewan government funded in Regina. They called it Conservation House Project. And so in 1978 and 79, they built this project that they had thick walls using that Larson Truss. They had the first HRV was in that building. It's still operating. And that's also one of the buildings that was the basis of the Passive House standard. Because when Germany, they were trying to figure out how they could reduce their dependence on nuclear power, and the option that they came up with was to reduce the energy use required to operate their housing stock. And so they toured around to a whole bunch of energy efficient building projects, and that conservation house was one of them. So, Canada's really got a lot of history in being, well, it used to have a lot of history in being a pioneer of energy efficient design, but we unfortunately have kind of dropped the ball in developing it. So,
well, don't you feel that we're kind of like to keep up with the Joneses? Like, we see other people with stick frame houses, and it seems like we want to have the same thing, or we want to go really big. And I don't think that that's really something we should be doing in Manitoba. It gets too hot and too cold here for having these, ridiculously big houses that then become monstrosities to heat and cool and to be comfortable in. And also the repairs, upkeep, and maintenance on stick frame homes is a lot higher than something that is well conceived. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and we've actually been able to partner with a company called CFAR that is providing a total cost of building ownership analysis that we've been able to incorporate into our kind of sales toolbox. And
that's great. And so, what is the average lifespan of one of your homes versus a regular stick frame?
It's kind of hard to say because obviously we haven't been building for very long. But I think, if we look at the conventional housing stock or the average age of housing stock in Manitoba, we've got most of the buildings starting around the late 1800s and moving into the early 1900s. And that it's a pretty average age, especially in Winnipeg here. We're one of the oldest cities in Canada in terms of the age of our housing stock. And these houses are all still standing, and so I think the potential for for our buildings is, over a century for sure. And I think,
But you can see the evolution of the building structures. From the wartime and before, we see a structure that has, it's actual wood versus now we're starting to get into compressed wood and all these other variations as we go along. And I know when I drive past some of the newer homes and I can actually see like a wow happening right in the roof structure now. And, so it's obviously something is not quite the same, and the trussing systems are supposed to be engineered, but are they the same? And I think you take a lot of consideration into how your structure is put together.
No, and you look at the liability too with, in terms of like the TGI joists, for example, have had, they don't hold up in a fire. And so there's definitely, I think, kind of throughout the industry, we've heard some people say that, a new conventional build, you might be lucky if you get 50 or 60 years out of these before you start having major issues. And we've actually talked to some customers that have purchased brand new builds recently, and 5 years, 6 years in, they're already starting to see some major performance issues, which are leading to structural issues in the buildings. And it's mainly thermal bridging or lack of insulation and air sealing or vapor barriers that cause condensation and moisture buildup, which leads to the degradation of the structure. So.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We're gonna have to take a break and hear from one of our sponsors at Case Populaire. But what I did want to just say is when we return, I would love to talk about insulation and the importance of that as well. Because everything you do really goes hand in hand. But let's talk about that insulation, and we'll be right back. Hey, and we're back. So I wanted to talk about insulation. Can you describe what would the insulation in the walls and the ceiling look like in one of your homes?
So we use cellulose insulation almost exclusively. We try to avoid foam insulation products as much as possible. And one of the main reasons for that is because building energy efficient has to take carbon emissions into account. If we're going to do anything about climate change, we need to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that we are creating. And it's completely possible to build a high performance, energy efficient house using all foam insulation products. But if you look at the total carbon emissions from the building, including those from the manufacturing of the products, a super insulated, energy efficient building constructed out of foam has more carbon emissions over its lifetime than a standard code built building. So, we need to be cognizant of the fact that if we're going to make an impact on carbon emissions and on the global carbon emissions, then we need to be building with insulation products and materials that are organically based. So wood frame buildings that are insulated with cellulose insulation actually sequester carbon within the structure for the lifetime of those buildings. Potentially at the end of the lifetime, that there's nothing wrong with those insulation and framing materials that could potentially be recycled.
It's interesting. So cellulose, isn't that just like recycled paper products and things of that nature?
Yeah, cellulose is 100%. Well, the product that we purchase is a 100% post-consumer recycled paper with a boric acid added as a fire retardant, and it also keeps the bugs out.
Gotcha. So this is something that is already out there. These companies just bring it in and recycle it, and then it's cellulose.
Yeah,
they add their value to it, obviously.
Right, which is minimal, and just the boric acid for the company that we purchased through it. And that is actually a company that operates in Manitoba and in a small town. They're down in Morden, and they don't have to ship in any paper waste to satisfy their demand for product. So they're able to manufacture enough cellulose to keep their business running just with the paper waste that's generated in Morden. So that gives you an idea of how local this type
It
of
really
product.
is, because actually there's a company that sorts the paper product here in Marchand, Manitoba, actually La Broquerie, Manitoba. I think for that company, they do the final stuff to it, but these guys sort it and get it ready for all of that stuff.
Yeah, I believe Morden actually, as part of their recycling program, they separate out paper waste, so it's already a lot cleaner to begin with. So
Yeah. Yeah,
but
yeah, that's my
definitely,
understanding too, and I like to see that where we're actually getting it from Manitoba. You know, we created the waste here. It's nice that it stays here and we repurpose it here. You know, and just goes to show you can do your part very easily by adding back into and just keeping this stuff being used in some way.
right. And for, like for a residential building, I think the last building that we put up was around 1,700 square feet. We had just about 13,000 pounds of cellulose went into that building. So
Wow.
that's 13,000 pounds of recycled content. The building at Fort White is just about 30,000 pounds of cellulose that's going into it. So it's a very considerable amount of recycled material.
And it's probably going to be in use another 100 years.
Well, or 200 years
Or
potentially.
200.
And
Yeah. I
so
mean,
then,
that's exciting. And now it becomes carbon emission, it's almost absorbing it too, right? So,
well, so that's the other thing. But like cellulose is about 40% carbon by weight. And so, you're looking at, almost 10 tons of carbon that's sequestered in that building for the lifetime of the building. And so if you use that to offset the very low emissions that the building is going to have because it's energy efficient, we're basically at a net zero carbon emission from the building
that's amazing.
over the
That's
course of its
amazing.
lifetime.
Just by building your home, you could be offsetting 10 tons.
Right.
That's
It's not
incredible.
insignificant. And that's just the
No,
cellulose. That doesn't include the wood framing, which is also, significant carbon content.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking of that, because we're always trying to think, well, where can we repurpose this, reuse this? But ultimately, we want to offset our carbon footprint. And I mean, we're learning more about this as we go and how to do this better. Especially with everybody talks about carbon tax and all of this stuff. That's going to become a much harsher reality coming up. I mean, we literally don't have anywhere for this waste to go anymore without it becoming a bigger issue. So we're looking at ways to, what can we do with this, right? How can we repurpose this? How can we get rid of it? How can we reduce the emissions to our atmosphere? And so, like, the Canadian government has actually unleashed quite a few calls for just that equipment and things that, what do you have out there that can take the emissions out and reduce our carbon footprint? So there's big dollars out there from the Canadian government, even for companies that can help them with that problem.
Right. I think the thing that everyone needs to understand too is that the best way to reduce carbon emissions is to stop making them in the first place. And so
Yes.
if we can build or change the standards that we build commercial and residential buildings so that they emit very little amount of carbon by removing the requirement for natural gas heating systems, that's when you can really start to have a big impact on the carbon emissions. And I mean, another point that, like, we realize, 200 years is not a long time to sequester that carbon, but the idea is that potentially within 200 years, we can figure out what the heck we're doing so that we have a longer term solution. But in the meantime, this at least buys us some time to be able to sort out, what we do with that carbon down the road.
Well, I believe, and this is, I know it already exists, the technology out there to take that, and actually you can run it through a burner that's been run by solar and take 98% out, only 2% emission, and then you repurpose the carbon back into an ash dried product that can then be separated. And like there's carbon 110, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. It's actually worth $1 a pound.
Right.
That is actually a commodity. And they actually suspect there might be some graphene in there too. So the technology is already there. We need to get it commercialized. And that's what's going to ultimately where the end game will be for some of these things when they're outweighed all of their usability. so that it's not just being like, well, I mean, some of the places they're putting some of this stuff is they're basically pushing it in the ground
Yeah.
and covering it up, you know, but we've just got so much waste these days. We really do. People are naturally wasteful by nature now. This never happened 100 years ago. You know, everything was repurposed or reutilized until it really had no use.
Yeah, no, and it was out of necessity, right? We've kind of got ourselves to
Absolutely. Even flower bags, you know, I still have some flower tea towels from my mom, who got them from her mom because they used to sell flower bags that had patterns on it, because they knew women would keep the bags and make hand towels out of them.
Right.
And how did we end up here where everything is a throwaway? You know, and what I love about what you're doing is you're not only taking a house and you're making it way more efficient. You spend a lot of time, your group, in designing something that is going to have a long lifespan, which I think is way better. It's like building a television 70 years ago. You built it to last, right? And now you've got these LED screens. I mean, great, they save energy, but do they last? You know, I'd rather spend another couple $100 if I'm talking about this LED screen and have a product that's going to last me 20 years.
Right.
You know, but really, I mean, these things are only meant to last a year. I mean, and that's the reality, because even if you buy your brand new fridge, go check your warranty. It's a year.
Yeah.
I guarantee you it's a year. They may be super, you know, insulated and energy efficient, and we do recommend that you be as energy efficient as you want. But the thing is, at the end of the day, sometimes when they break, you can't fix them, you know, because of how they build them. They really don't put a lot of care into the structure, if you will, of their component anymore, because people will still buy it. It doesn't matter. They want the newest, latest, greatest, whatever. They don't even look at the thing that says, you know, it's funny because some of my solar stuff has 25 and 20-year warranties, and people ask me about these warranties, and I'm like, but you just bought a brand new fridge.
Right.
How much did you spend on that?
Yeah.
You know,
I'm gonna stop making parts for it in 2 years. So.
And your brand new house that you just bought, you had a 5-year warranty on. For most builders.
Yeah, if that.
It's true. It's true. So, you know, one of the things I love about your company, and I did know your dad. He was an amazing guy. I actually toured one of your passive houses, and he was telling me how, you know, you guys were doing the insulation. I was in there before, like, it was all, you know, finished. It was, you were just past the walls and just getting to the insulation part. So it was pretty incredible to be in at that stage. It was cold, it was winter, but I was loving every minute of it, spending the time with your dad before then. And, you know, it was really nice, the passion I could hear in him and the passion I hear in you, you know, because really it is about that. I think a lot of us that started in this industry, and I'll call it the renewable energy kind of industry, right, where we may be working at different ends, but the end you are is the foundation for everything I do. Right. I believe, you know, I'm in solar, I'm in, you know, creating energy and storing energy, but you are too, because what you're doing is, with these types of homes anyways, you don't need to use as much energy. You know, if I can put a 4 kilowatt solar system on one of your homes and virtually run the home with the amount of energy it requires. And that's incredible.
That's exactly the ethos that we build by, where we're reducing that primary energy demand to the point where you're saving your recapitalization costs on your renewable energy for a net zero house, for example. Yes. And as you said, that, well, like the Kylemore house, I think was the one that you toured, that has a 5 kilowatt solar array, which makes that house net zero. And so if you look at the long-term maintenance or the total cost of building ownership for that house, and we know that there is a recapitalization period for the solar products, and you got a 20 to 25 year warranty. But we know the house is going to last for potentially 200 years. And every 25 years, you have a recapitalization period on that solar array. Would you rather recapitalize a 20 kilowatt system or a 5 kilowatt
The
system?
watt
Right?
system.
And so that's a reduction in that total cost of ownership that we're going for, and that that builds resilience into the house, and that resilience lasts as long as the house is standing.
With solar too, it's changing so radically. I mean, the foundations, basically within 5 years, even all we're going to see is energy sustainable houses. They're going to have their own storage. They're not even going to be connected to a grid anymore. Why? Because we already have the technology, to be fair. It's just a matter of people implementing them at this point,
Right.
and having the foundation, i.e., what you build, in order to make that way more feasible. And so as people start to build these more feasible homes, we're going to see them coming together, and the whole plan is for them to just be energy incumbent with themselves. So they're going to be basically contained. They'll be producing, storing, and utilizing their own energies. You won't have a grid attached to them anymore. And that's the reality. That is where we're going to be. We see some areas in Winnipeg, for instance, where the infrastructure is very bad. Really, it has to be changed or upgraded. There's so many new constructions that have happened that they can barely service. The reason why they advertise gas heating so much is because they know that if they had all of these electric furnaces go online, they'd have to put in a whole bunch more 200 amp services that they can't service.
Right.
And then now you've got people getting electric cars on top of this, right?
Yeah.
Our systems, for instance, can give you the rapid charging for your electric car and do that integrated storage system. But one of the things that has to be said too about the foundation of what you do and creating these homes with such long lasting, they're going to retain those values. People are going to become more and more concerned about the cost of a home, the cost to run that home. So
absolutely. And I mean, and the cost is not the only factor too. Cost is almost peripheral. When you look at the kind of monthly savings, most people don't really see that as being a really large incentive. But when you start compounding that with the health benefits of living in a house that has fresh air ventilation, that's filtered, that has no cold spots or drafts, so you're adding the health and the interior occupant comfort that's just unparalleled. Once the majority of consumers that are in the market for a new house kind of experience that level of comfort and health from their home, there's just not going to be a market for anything less, And so as these buildings become more popular and more people experience that interior occupant comfort, and that's designed into the house. The reason that we don't have great big tall windows and that kind of thing is because typically those are the areas that are uncomfortable to be around in the wintertime. And so you make sure that in your design that there are no spots within the interior of the house that are less than 20 degrees Celsius. That's part of the design criteria for a passive house. And that's what leads to that occupant comfort, which is a huge selling feature for most people,
That makes a lot of sense. I know in 2006, we had built a stick frame home that had increased insulation, though. And, back then we went open loop geothermal. And, it's interesting that at the time, nobody could tell me. I wanted to know, so does it cool enough? Does it, I was trying to understand if it was going to keep my house cool enough, because I understood that my house wasn't, even though I had increased the insulation beyond what was recommended, I knew that I would need it because it was still a stick frame house, right? Yeah. And it was interesting that it did everything that they couldn't tell me it would do. I was very pleased. It was like having comfort all the time. Like it didn't, if you like, plus 40 in your house, it's not going to do that. It really won't. Right. But if you are 22 Celsius kind of person, you know what? Summer, winter, it didn't matter. I had comfort, and it never felt like a hot spot or a cold spot. It always just felt good. But I know when that thing went out in the summer, because I had one of the earlier renditions of whatever. So I had like a pump go, and I had to wait 2 weeks. And I know that my house did not sustain well. Like it was plus 30 in the house readily.
Well, and that's the thing. We can't rely on these
Cats.
technical, mechanical devices to keep
That's where I was
house
going
comfortable.
with this. Yeah, because your home would never be that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would take an awful lot before it would get to that. It kind of is like being in a cozy basement, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're buffered from the heat flash and the cold flash of what's outside.
Yeah.
And I'm in a log home right now, which is very similar to the way it thermal loads.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we get to that drop dead point where it's going to get hot no matter what we do because it didn't cool off enough at night.
Yeah.
And those types of scenarios, just like you,
Mm-hmm.
because it's thermal loading, right?
Yeah.
You know, you're loading the coal or you're loading the heat, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I have a 2,000 square foot house and we rely on this thermal loading, exactly what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you, there's a 5,000 BTU. Do you know how small that is?
Yeah. It's
500 watts.
Yeah.
It's a window air conditioner, and I only turn it on when I'm cooking.
Right. Yeah.
and that's enough to bleed that heat
Mm-hmm.
that I create myself while
Yeah.
cooking. And as long as I don't have any creation of my own, the house stays really good. Almost like a bit like being in a basement, but cozier. Not
Right. Yeah.
right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's where passive houses just really make sense to me, because we live in something that is a rendition of that. You know, to me, I think that it's crazy to not even consider this at this point. I think that we all know that the environment just can't sustain doing things that will break in X amount of time.
Yeah.
And let's face it, if we're putting on shingles that aren't going to last 5 years, that's waste.
Mm-hmm.
That is now coming off your roof and new stuff going back on your roof. Why can't we use stuff that actually lasts 30 years?
Right. Well, and here's an opportunity for the lending institutions to get on board as well, because if you put those 5-year shingles on your brand new house, the value in that is going to be affected very quickly. And so if you're looking at it from a lending perspective, you want the value to stay in that house for as long as it can so that your asset is protected. And so if you're
right, and I think they're starting to get savvy to that, aren't they?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a few of the financial institutions that are getting on board, but also through that CFAR analysis that we were talking about earlier, those guys have been able to present to the Canadian Appraisal Institute, and the Appraisal Institute was really lacking a way to monetize energy efficient additions to your house. So you go to the bank and you say, you know, I'm going to build this house, but it's going to cost me 12, 15% more, or, you know, I'm going to put solar on, I'm going to super insulate it. And the bank would say, well, but we can't quantify the value. We can't give you more money to do that because we can't quantify the value of that.
Right.
But now using the CFAR analysis, what it essentially does is it monetizes the net present value of those energy efficient upgrades. So you're able to give a dollar value today to what energy savings you're going to realize throughout the lifetime of that building. And the CFAR analysis uses all kinds of standard cost escalation factors that the appraisal community is already very familiar with. So they immediately bought in because they realized that it's solving a problem for the appraisers, because previously they just didn't give a value to energy efficient items, but it's in their mandate that they can't ignore any item that should have a reasonable effect on value. And because they had no way to monetize the value of that energy efficient upgrade, they had to leave it out, which is essentially against their code of conduct. So they were really interested to see the CFAR evaluation, which gave that dollar value to the energy efficient upgrades. So now they're able to incorporate a value to the energy efficient upgrades and justify that to your lending institution to say, this is what the value of these energy efficient upgrades are and what the value that they're going to provide for the owner, you know, for years down the road. That the CFAR evaluation goes to a 60-year model, but we think that's it needs to be extended, because obviously we're talking about much longer lifetime for these type of buildings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. But that's amazing. I didn't know about that. I hope to see that soon, actually. That would be very interesting. I just actually had this done on my home, and they had trouble with the evaluations because I have both an on and off grid system here.
Mhm.
So I have storage capacity. I can run completely independent of the grid if I want to, but I also can service the grid with 10
Right.
kilowatts of solar. And I have thermal as well. So on this home. So yeah, it was really hard to talk about that energy independence with the company that came and did the estimation on the house value.
Right.
So I agree. These kinds of notions need to change.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to see that document, to see how that calculation is done. That's interesting. So I just wanted to thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been so informative, and I'd love to have you back maybe in the summer if you're going through one of your projects. Let's do some video.
Absolutely, yeah.
When the restrictions are a little lighter, perhaps.
Yeah. No kidding.
So.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Lorena. This was very enjoyable.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Evan, and you have yourself a great day. Thank you very much, evolutionaries. That's it for today, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.